Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Helena Lewis had never been the kind of woman to chase rainbows. Life had taught her early that some colors were simply illusions, dancing in the storm. Her world revolved around one little girl with a peanut allergy, 2 chipped mugs, and 3 jobs that barely met the needs of a one-bedroom apartment in Glen Cove. There was no room for fantasies when every dawn meant hurrying a sleepy child into school shoes while tying her own head wrap with one hand and reading client messages with the other. But that morning, as she applied lip balm in the cracked side mirror of her car, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a shout, just a whisper, the kind that grows louder in stillness. She had just received a promotion email from Majestic Keys. Her name had been recommended to replace a resigned senior marketer, and though temporary, it was the crack in the ceiling she had prayed for. It meant less field work, more strategic input, and finally being seen beyond the stamp of that single mother who never says no to extra shifts. Helena stood outside the building's glass door for a moment longer than usual, chest tight, fingers trembling slightly. It had taken her 8 years to rise from the receptionist desk to this moment, not because she lacked talent, but because she had once put her dreams in the glove compartment to make space for diapers, debts, and disappointment. When she entered the building that day, a new pair of black flats squeaked on the polished floors like a declaration, and the moment the elevator doors closed around her, she whispered to herself, "We're not just surviving anymore, Liana. We're climbing." The office had the scent of pine air freshener and espresso beans, a combination that Helena secretly loved. It reminded her of work ethic and warmth. Her new seat came with a desk that had a name tag freshly printed in gold foil, Helena Lewis, Interim Brand Strategist. It was a simple desk by all standards, but for Helena, it was a throne carved from sweat and silence. She unpacked carefully, placing a picture of Liana beside her monitor, then lighting a small vanilla-scented candle when no one was looking. There was a rhythm in the office, a buzz of ringing phones, clacking heels, and half-whispered negotiations, and Helena moved through it like a seasoned conductor. She handled a luxury client's pitch that first week, proposed a social media strategy that impressed the board, and even stayed back to fix a back-end flaw that wasn't her responsibility. But it wasn't the extra work that made people notice. It was how she made success look like a melody rather than a scream. And then, like a shadow slipping into the corner of a sunny room, he walked in. Damian Price, the kind of man whose cologne arrived before he did. His eyes were the color of roasted chestnuts and just as deceptive, warm on the outside, impossible to crack. He wore confidence like a fitted suit, and his teeth sparkled not just with dental precision, but with the kind of smile that made women second-guess their vows. When he reached Helena's desk, he tilted his head slightly and said, "You're the storm they've been whispering about. Finally, I get to meet the woman behind all the noise." Helena didn't flinch. She looked up slowly, returned the smile with one of her own, cool, controlled. "And you are?" she asked, not with rudeness, but a politeness that had sharp edges. Damien chuckled, his laugh low and practiced. Just another man trying not to be outshined. It was the kind of moment that hangs in the air, a seed planted but yet to bloom. Over the next few weeks, Helena discovered that Damien was the office's untouchable, top closer, crown jewel, the kind of man who could sell sand to a desert prince and walk out with a thank you note. Women flocked around him like moths to scented danger. His charm wasn't loud, it was laced into the pauses. The way he listened like each woman's story was a rare manuscript. But Helena wasn't built for flattery. Her life had been one long syllabus in hardship, and compliments were lessons she'd learned not to trust without proof. Yet there was something about the way Damien remembered the smallest details, how she took her coffee, that she liked mint in her water, that she sometimes drew storyboards with her daughter on sticky notes. He didn't push, didn't prod. He simply stayed nearby, the way music lingers after a film ends. And bit by bit, Helena found herself letting down her guard, not entirely, but just enough to smile a little longer when he walked by. One Friday evening, after a successful campaign presentation, Damien offered her a ride. The rain had started to fall like the sky was scrubbing itself clean, and Helena, tired and without an umbrella, hesitated for just a breath before saying yes. In his car, he played jazz and drove slowly, talking about everything from his childhood in South Glen to how he lost his mother to breast cancer at 15. The way he spoke, measured, vulnerable, threaded with loss, made something in Helena's chest ache in a way she hadn't allowed in years. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the first time in a long time that her heart didn't feel like an abandoned house with locked doors. Damien became a presence, constant yet not overbearing. He didn't ask to come in. He waited by the door, made her laugh without asking why she hadn't smiled. He brought her pepper soup one day when she had a cough, left a note on her desk saying, "A queen should never cough alone." And for Helena, who had learned to wear strength like armor, it felt good, frighteningly good, to be noticed in a way that didn't ask her to shrink or perform. Liana adored him too. He once showed up to her school's career day and described real estate as helping people find the walls they'll cry, laugh, and grow within. Helena watched him from the back of the room, arms crossed but eyes soft. Could a man like that really be just what he seemed? She didn't know. But what she did know was that her life was beginning to carry color again, subtle hues at first, but hues nonetheless. Yet somewhere in her bones, the kind that never stopped being cautious, a quiet whisper stirred, the same rain that waters roses can also flood the roots. She brushed it off. Not because she believed it wrong, but because sometimes the heart wants to rest its weight, even when the bench creaks underfoot. The weeks melted into one another like hot wax on candlelight, slow but purposeful. Helena had always believed that routine was the quiet thread that stitched sanity together, but with Damien's growing presence, her days began to take a different shape. There was a rhythm now, a delicate two-step she hadn't rehearsed, but found herself dancing to with curious ease. Each morning came with a thoughtful message or a joke slid under her coffee cup like a secret only they shared. He was never loud about his affection. Instead, he tiptoed into her guarded spaces like a man who knew better than to knock on wounded doors. Helena, for all her steel and sense, began to let him in, not all the way, but enough for sunlight to enter. Her friends at work noticed. "You're glowing like a fresh coat of paint," one had teased, to which she responded with a coy smile she hadn't worn in years. She didn't deny it. Damien was thoughtful, present, and seemed to understand that her strength wasn't a wall to climb, but a song to learn the melody of. One evening, after a long meeting, he walked her to her car and simply said, "Helena, it's okay to lean. Even trees sway when the wind gets too strong." The words hit her chest like warm rain, unexpected and comforting. She didn't reply, just looked at him as though the silence between them was safer than any sentence she could construct. In the quiet, she felt her resolve shifting, not because she wanted to be saved, but because, for once, someone seemed willing to meet her where she stood, not where they wished to place her. Liana, in her innocent and intuitive way, had taken a liking to Damien like a duck to water. Children had a way of sensing sincerity, and the way her daughter clung to his every word made Helena both joyful and cautious. She didn't want to rush this, didn't want to introduce a revolving door of male figures into Liana's life like a game of emotional musical chairs. But Damien had a way of weaving himself into their lives without demanding space. He helped Liana with her science project one Saturday afternoon, crouched beside the dining table in a plain white t-shirt, laughing as he glued pieces of cardboard together and blew on the paint to make it dry faster. Helena watched them from the kitchen, stirring her jollof rice while pretending not to smile too wide. It felt real. It felt good. But she had been down a similar road before, where sweet words had become sour and warm hands had turned cold. So while one half of her soaked in the simplicity of those afternoons, the other half filed away every inconsistency like a ledger. The time he said he had a late call, but his status showed active now on social media. The moment he flinched when she asked if he had family around. The hesitation in his voice when she invited him to a company dinner and he declined, saying he wasn't ready to define anything yet. There were small cracks, barely noticeable unless you stared long enough. And Helena, being a woman forged in fire, knew better than to ignore the scent of smoke when she saw it curling under the door. Her work at Majestic Keys continued to flourish. With the new campaign for the Palms residences launching, she was tasked with co-leading strategy and presentation alongside Damien. It was a project that carried weight. If they pulled it off, Helena's position could become permanent, and Damien would cement his seat as the face of elite sales. Working with him closely meant long hours, private brainstorming sessions, and shared victories. It was during one of those strategy nights, seated across from each other in the conference room while the city blinked sleepily beyond the glass walls, that Damien opened up, or so it seemed. He spoke about his father, who had left when he was 8, and how he vowed never to become a man who made promises he couldn't keep. His voice had trembled just enough to pass the test of authenticity, and Helena, whose own wounds had always been stitched beneath the surface, felt a thread of compassion tighten. She reached out, laid her hand over his briefly, and said, "We've both had to become our own parachutes." He looked at her then, eyes soft, and whispered, "But even parachutes need something to hold on to before they open." In that moment, she didn't question his truth. She simply accepted it, tucked it into the pocket of her heart, and chose, for the first time in years, not to interrogate her joy. But like milk left unattended on fire, what simmers in silence eventually boils over. One Saturday afternoon, Helena went to pick up Liana from ballet practice earlier than usual. Her daughter had left her pink scarf in Damien's car the day before, and he had promised to drop it off with the instructor. But when Helena arrived, the scarf wasn't there, and the instructor mentioned something odd. The gentleman said he was going to drop it off before heading to Fairgrove Mall with his niece. Sweet of him to be so hands-on. Helena's lips smiled, but her eyes didn't. Damien had told her he was flying to Wesley for a cousin's wedding that weekend. She nodded politely and walked back to her car, heart thudding in slow disbelief. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe plans changed. Maybe he postponed his trip. Maybe she heard wrong. But the pit in her stomach had already taken root. That evening, when she called, his line rang out. Twice. On the third attempt, he picked up, breathless, claiming he was just stepping out of church. Helena didn't confront him, not yet. She simply said, "No problem, just wanted to hear your voice," and ended the call. That night, while Liana slept beside her, Helena stared at the ceiling and whispered to no one in particular, "If you must wear a mask, be sure it fits, because sooner or later, even smiles start to itch." She wasn't sure what Damien was hiding, but she knew a masquerade when she saw one. She danced around too many not to recognize the rhythm. Helena stood outside the mall, arms wrapped tightly around herself, though the evening breeze barely had teeth. She felt like the floor beneath her had shifted, even though the earth stood still. Inside Fairgrove Mall, she had gone looking for a discount on Liana's school shoes, a simple errand on a quiet weekend. But fate had a funny way of letting the truth whisper when you least expected it. From behind the rack of children's sneakers, she had seen him. Damien, the same man who shared Zobo with her on slow evenings, and who helped Liana sculpt a volcano from old shoeboxes, sat at a nearby cafe table with a little girl whose eyes mirrored his. The woman beside him laughed easily, tossing her light brown curls over her shoulder as she leaned in toward him with practiced ease. And then the child, small hands covered in strawberry ice cream, called him Daddy. The word didn't roar. It didn't slam. It simply landed like a match on dry leaves. Helena had frozen mid-step, her fingers clamped around a box of cartoon print trainers. For a moment, her mind tried to explain it away, to stitch excuses like a seamstress desperate to mend a ripped wedding dress. But her heart didn't wait for confirmation. It understood before her eyes could process it. Damien, the man who wore grief like a designer cologne to lure her in, had been living a double life, hiding a family in plain sight. She remembered something her grandmother used to say: a snake that sleeps in the sun is still a snake. She wanted to turn, to scream, to demand answers. But all she did was leave the shoes on the shelf, walk straight to her car, and sit gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor her to something that made sense. The following evening, Damien invited her to dinner atop one of Glen Cove's rooftop restaurants, a place that looked like it had been plucked from a magazine spread. The skyline twinkled like sequins spilled across midnight velvet. Helena wore a simple navy dress, her hair pinned up neatly, her eyes calm. He arrived with his usual swagger, holding the chair out for her like he always did, charming in the way that made strangers smile and waiters lean in. They talked. Rather, he did. About work, about a difficult client, about a flat tire he swore he had last week, details he wove together like a seasoned magician distracting an audience. Helena nodded, asked just enough questions, smiled just enough times. But inside, she wasn't sitting at the table. She was sifting through his stories, untangling the lies knotted between sips of wine and forkfuls of overpriced pasta. She watched the way he gestured, noted the way he deflected any topic that tiptoed near his personal life. And then she asked him about B. Just once. A gentle, "How's your niece, B?" His pause was microscopic, but she caught it. "Oh, she's good," he said smoothly. "Always running around." Her gaze didn't waver, but her smile changed. It was no longer the smile of a woman wooed by affection. It was the smile of a woman who had finally seen behind the curtain. She dabbed her lips with the napkin, set it on her plate, and stood slowly. Damien looked up, surprised. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Helena picked up her purse, leaned slightly forward, and replied in a tone that was neither loud nor laced with anger. "I hope one day someone lies to your daughter the way you lied to me, so you can watch the truth steal her breath the way it stole mine." And with that, she turned and walked away. Helena's heels clicked softly against the rooftop tiles as she walked toward the elevator. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. Behind her, Damien remained seated, stunned, mouth slightly open like a man left speechless in the wake of a storm he didn't see coming. The city sparkled in the background, oblivious to the small war that had just ended on its skyline. Around her, string lights swayed gently in the breeze, casting golden halos around empty wine glasses and crumpled linen napkins. For the first time in weeks, her steps felt steady, her spine lifted not just by pride, but by the truth she carried like a quiet sword. The door of the elevator opened, and she stepped in without hesitation. Her reflection caught in the polished walls, curls bouncing, lips pressed, eyes gleaming not with sadness, but with resolve. As the elevator doors closed, Helena felt the first breath of freedom settle in her lungs. She wasn't walking away from a man. She was walking back to herself, the version of her that had been silenced by charm, manipulated by sweet nothings, and cornered by deception. And now she had opened a new door, one that Damien would never be invited through again. That night, as she drove home, the streets whispered with possibility, and the city, her city, welcomed her back, not as someone's almost, but as her own enough. Helena didn't wait for a grand apology or a flurry of explanations after that night. She didn't open her phone anticipating messages begging for forgiveness, and she certainly didn't pace the floor hoping he'd show up with flowers and a rewritten story. No, she'd already peeled the veil off the mirror and seen herself clearly, no longer the woman who needed to be chosen, but the woman who had already chosen herself. The Monday after the rooftop dinner, she arrived at Majestic Keys early, dressed in navy trousers and a crisp blouse that hugged her like purpose. Her steps were measured, her smile polite, but her presence filled the room like incense. Damien avoided her gaze during the morning briefing. He was dressed immaculately as always, but his usual swagger had taken a back seat, replaced by a stiffness in his shoulders and a nervous tapping of his pen against the table. Helena, seated across from him, didn't spare him more than a passing glance. Her energy had shifted, and it was louder than any words she could have spoken. In the quiet that followed the meeting, she returned to her office and began laying the groundwork for a different kind of confrontation, one that didn't require shouting or scandal, just precision and timing. She wasn't here to expose Damien for sport. She was here to remind herself and other women watching silently that no one feeds off your strength unless you keep setting the table for them. That afternoon, while sipping lukewarm hibiscus tea and reviewing the presentation slides for the upcoming Palms Residence's launch, Helena had an idea. It didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived slowly, like dawn easing into a dim room. She would let Damien speak. She would give him his moment. And then, when all eyes were on him, she would pivot the narrative not to shame him, but to shine a light on the emotional manipulation that too many women experienced in the workplace without ever naming it. She wouldn't mention his name. She didn't need to. The truth, when told well, didn't require labels to pierce skin. Her proposal was bold, a mini-session during the launch titled The Human Factor in Property Sales, When Emotions Become Currency. She framed it as a study on branding and buyer psychology, rooted in real stories, just enough to get the executive board intrigued. Her supervisor raised an eyebrow, but eventually approved it. "You've earned your space," he said. "Just make sure you stick to the theme." She nodded, already knowing her theme ran deeper than property values or client conversion rates. It was about perception, how a person can wear sincerity like cologne and still leave you gasping for air. Over the next few days, Helena worked like a woman possessed not by rage, but by the quiet fire of clarity. She gathered stories, created anonymized case studies, and rehearsed her delivery until each sentence rolled off her tongue with the weight of lived experience. She didn't need to make Damien the villain. He had already cast himself in that role. All she had to do was let the curtain lift. The day of the Palms Residence's launch arrived under a powder blue sky dusted with promise. The venue was pristine, every wine glass catching sunlight like crystal secrets. Clients, partners, and media personnel buzzed about in well-tailored clothes and practiced laughter. Damien was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, smile polished, handshake firm. To the outside world, he was every inch the golden boy, unshaken, unbothered. But Helena could see the cracks. His eyes darted every now and then to her direction, as though waiting for a cue that hadn't been rehearsed. She greeted him with grace, introduced him to potential buyers, and nodded as he complimented her poise. But beneath her smile was a blade, sheathed in silk. When it came time for the presentations, Damien went first. He dazzled the room as expected, sprinkling charm into metrics, painting luxury with his words. Applause followed. He bowed slightly and stepped aside. Then Helena walked up. The microphone felt light in her hand, but the truth it would carry was anything but. She began softly, speaking about trust as the cornerstone of real estate, about how people didn't just buy walls, they bought dreams, emotions, the idea of safety. "But what happens," she asked, her voice calm and measured, "when trust is packaged and sold back to us as performance?" She clicked to the next slide. It wasn't data, it was a story. One about a man in sales who preyed on women navigating grief, single parenthood, or loneliness. Her voice didn't tremble. It soared. With each line, the room shifted. People leaned in. Damien stiffened. Sweat gathered near his collar. But she never looked his way. Her final sentence rang like a bell in a quiet chapel. "We sell homes, yes, but let's not forget that the walls we build around others should never be the ones they have to tear down alone." When Helena stepped off the stage, there was no standing ovation, no dramatic gasps, just a room suspended in reflection, a silence so loud it made everyone check their own echoes. Damien disappeared from the venue shortly after. No explanations, no farewell handshakes, just vanished, like smoke escaping a shattered lantern. By evening, murmurs had started. Staff whispered. Clients wondered. Helena didn't fuel the gossip. She packed her presentation folder, thanked the coordinators, and slipped out quietly into the dusk. That night, she and Liana ate roasted corn by the balcony, legs tangled in an old blanket, laughter unbothered by what the world might say. "Did you win, Mummy?" Liana asked with cheeks full. Helena looked at her daughter, the reason she'd never folded, never crumbled, and smiled. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "I just remembered who I was." In her heart, she knew this wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a spark, a small fire that might warm the hearts of women still stuck in someone else's narrative. And as the night breeze kissed her cheek and the city lights blinked like slow applause, Helena leaned back and whispered, "Some storms don't destroy. Some storms cleanse." The fallout from the Palms Residence's event unfurled like a slow-burning ember in dry grass. Majestic Keys didn't call it a scandal, but whispers swirled through the corridors like perfumed smoke. Helena never offered commentary. She walked with her head high, her eyes calm, and her silence speaking volumes where explanations weren't needed. Damien, on the other hand, began unraveling quietly. He didn't return to the office for 3 days after the event, and when he finally did, the shimmer in his step had dulled to a muted shuffle. He stopped making jokes in the break room. His compliments grew rare, his phone calls shorter. Something in him had shifted, and not in the way that invites sympathy, but in the way that makes even a snake reconsider the comfort of its own skin. HR launched a quiet review, nothing loud, just the way corporate firms preferred to sweep discomfort into files. It wasn't about proof. It was about perception. And perception, when cracked, takes more than a grin to fix. Helena continued her work, producing results that even the directors began to notice with reverence. Her ideas carried the clarity of someone who had walked through fog and now understood the weather. Her colleagues, once unsure of how to categorize her, now spoke her name with a tone that blended curiosity and admiration. There were no fireworks, no sudden promotions, no dramatic email announcements, but sometimes a shift doesn't need a drum roll. Sometimes the right people simply begin to listen when the wrong noise fades. Outside of work, Helena began to taste her life again, slowly, like soup after fever. She and Liana started new routines, Saturday market strolls, Sunday afternoon braiding sessions, and movie nights where giggles replaced old silences. One particular evening, as they returned from a music recital at Liana's school, Helena found a white envelope tucked beneath her doormat. No postage, no handwriting, just her name, typed in small, neat letters. Inside was a note, short. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could be better than I was. I failed. I'm sorry." No signature. But she didn't need one. Apologies written without voice carry weight only if the receiver still needs the sound. Helena folded it once, then again, and slid it into the back of her drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that closure doesn't always arrive with closure. Sometimes it arrives with stillness. She didn't tell anyone about the note. Not because she wanted to protect him, but because she didn't need it to be a story. That chapter had closed. What remained was the task of planting joy in the soil where hurt once bloomed. That week, she volunteered to mentor 2 junior colleagues, both women, both sharp, both uncertain if their voices belonged in rooms filled with suits and strategic nods. Helena didn't lecture. She listened. Because sometimes it did, and just didn't know it yet. They looked at her like someone had handed them light. The sun always returns after a storm, but it never comes back quite the same. In the following month, Helena's strategy proposal for an urban regeneration campaign was shortlisted by the board. It was a big win, one that could position her beyond Majestic Keys if she chose to. The idea had grown out of her experiences, from every lie she'd been fed, every promise unkept, every late night spent rewriting her narrative on paper while Liana slept in the next room. Her pitch centered around the emotional architecture of homes, how walls weren't just cement, but memories, resilience, identity. The board members leaned in when she spoke. They nodded slowly, not because they understood completely, but because her conviction made them want to. When she left the room that day, she didn't walk like someone who had performed. She walked like someone who had arrived. And that evening, while reviewing her notes in her apartment, Liana sat beside her on the rug with a crayon-stained notebook. "Mummy," she said, "can I be like you when I grow up?" Helena paused, heart softening into something near tears. "No," she said, smiling. "Be better than me. Be so bold that the world adjusts its posture when you enter the room." That night, sleep came easily for the first time in weeks. Not the sleep of escape, but the sleep of completion, when the mind stops reaching backward for answers and finally stretches forward toward peace. It was on a warm Saturday morning, while trimming the hibiscus in her tiny front garden, that Helena saw Damien again. Not at a gala, not at the office, but on the sidewalk near the Artisan's Cafe across the road. He looked older, just slightly. Not in the gray hair kind of way, but in the way regret sits behind the eyes of someone who thought they'd never be seen through. Their gazes met briefly. He gave a half nod. Not a wave, not a smile, just a gesture. She nodded back, then returned to her shears. He stood there for a few seconds longer, then walked away without speaking. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't tragic. It was simply a man passing by a woman who no longer looked at him through the lens of what could have been. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even numb. She was clear. Later that day, she met with one of the firm's directors for a casual lunch. He spoke about a branch opening in another city, Marigold, and asked if she'd consider leading its creative direction. It was a bold opportunity. A new chapter. Helena stirred her drink slowly, then looked up with the poise of someone who knew she held the pen. "Let me think about it," she said, because this time she wasn't rushing into anything. She'd learned that even when the ground beneath you gives way, you can still land on truth, and truth, once rooted, never wilts. The first morning Helena stepped into the Marigold branch, the city wore a fresh coat of dew and possibility. The office space still smelled of paint and packaging, and the air buzzed not with noise, but with the hush of beginnings. There were no framed awards yet, no polished plaques, just the raw echo of footsteps and the murmur of unfamiliar voices eager to leave a mark. Helena didn't stride in like a boss. She flowed in like a breeze that knew which corners to soften. The team she was handed was young and wide-eyed, a mix of bright ambition and quiet insecurity. They reminded her of who she had been in Glen Cove all those years ago, eager, uncertain, afraid to take up space. So she led not with a loud voice, but with steady presence. She listened before she instructed, observed before she adjusted. She asked questions that made them think, not just about campaigns and client decks, but about voice, worth, legacy. By the second week, laughter had started threading itself into work hours, and ideas began to take the shape of something brave. One intern stayed after hours, just to tell her, "I didn't think someone like me could fit in here, until you spoke today." Helena didn't reply with a lecture. She just smiled and said, "Sometimes all you need is one crack of light to believe there's a door." That night, as she lay on a mattress still waiting for its bed frame, Helena ran her fingers over the bare wall and whispered, "We are building again, but this time on our own terms." Liana adjusted to Marigold with the effortless resilience of a child raised in love. Her new school had wider playgrounds, bigger windows, and a science teacher who believed experiments should end in laughter. She made friends faster than Helena could learn the names of their parents. Every evening, she came home with stories bubbling out of her like soda shaken under sunlight. Helena listened, sometimes tired, sometimes distracted, but always with one hand cupping her daughter's voice like a fragile flame. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing books into a new shelf, Leanna turned suddenly and asked, "Do people stop lying when they grow up?" Helena paused mid-reach. The question felt like a stone thrown into a quiet stream. "Not always," she answered softly, placing a book on the shelf. "But some people start telling the truth after they lose someone who believed them." Leanna blinked, nodded in the way children do when their souls register a weight they're too young to carry. Then she went back to coloring, and the moment passed, but not forgotten. It was in those small exchanges that Helena measured her growth, not in promotions or paychecks, but in the wisdom she passed on without sounding bitter. Damien no longer lived in her thoughts. He was a chapter she no longer reread, a voice she didn't pause to hear in crowds. She didn't track his whereabouts, didn't scroll for updates, didn't dissect old memories for hidden meaning. Letting go hadn't been an act of anger. It had been an act of self-respect. She had peeled him off like old wallpaper, not with violence, but with care. Because healing isn't always about replacing what was lost, it's about nurturing what remains. Spring came to Marigold with cherry blossoms that littered the sidewalks like soft confetti. The office had begun earning its stripes. Clients were signing, campaigns were gaining traction, and her team now walked with shoulders a little higher. One afternoon, during a creative review, a young analyst named Ezra pitched an idea that didn't land well. His voice shook, his hands trembled, and silence threatened to swallow the room whole. Helena waited until the silence settled fully, then leaned forward and said, "Good seeds sometimes sprout in crooked rows. Say it again, and this time forget we're watching." He repeated his idea. Slower. Clearer. The room clapped. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. That was what Helena had taught them without a syllabus. Courage was not about being loud. It was about standing, even when your knees echo fear. Later that evening, she received a message on her phone. No name. Just a number she hadn't seen in over a year. "I heard about Marigold. I always said you were something special." She stared at it briefly, then locked the screen. No reply. Some messages are meant to be read, not answered. That weekend, she was invited to speak at a regional women's business forum. The hall was filled with faces hungry for permission to rise. Helena took the stage in a mustard blouse and navy slacks, her voice calm, her presence thunder in soft shoes. She didn't talk about heartbreak. She talked about rediscovery. "You don't need to be louder," she told them. "You just need to believe your voice was never a whisper in the first place." The applause that followed wasn't noise. It was recognition. The night of her one-year anniversary in Marigold, Helena organized a small dinner for her team. Not in a fancy hall, but in her backyard, under string lights, with home-cooked meals and laughter that dripped down from the trees. She wore a loose white dress, barefoot in the grass, with Liana running between guests carrying plates of puff-puff and jollof like a seasoned hostess. As the evening deepened, one of her staff raised a glass and said, "To the woman who made room at the table and taught us we didn't have to shrink to sit." Helena's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she had cried the right tears long ago, and now she honored joy with stillness. When the night ended and the last chair was folded away, she stood under the stars, arms crossed loosely, heart wrapped in a kind of peace she hadn't known existed. Not peace handed to her, but peace she built with her own two hands, brick by brick, breath by breath. The mistakes of yesterday no longer held power. The betrayals didn't own the blueprint. She had rewritten the script, cast herself as the lead, and this time the curtain had risen on truth, not illusion. As Leanna curled into her bed and whispered, "Night, Mummy," Helena walked to the window, looked out into the quiet city, and smiled. She was no longer waiting for the storm to pass. She had danced in the rain, dried herself with truth, and now she stood where the sun met her scars, unhidden, undefeated, and finally home. Sometimes the most dangerous lies come wrapped in kindness and attention. Be discerning. Not every comforting hand is meant to hold you. Some are only there to reach what they want from you. Never let loneliness rush you into loyalty. The right person will never make you question your worth or dim your light to brighten theirs. And if someone breaks your trust, let that be the last thing they break. You are allowed to begin again, stronger and wiser. Healing is not a sign of weakness. It's the quiet roar of a soul that chose itself. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of truth, for exposing what was hidden, and for giving strength to rise when love disappoints. I pray for every listener who has been misled, used, or brokenhearted. Lord, restore their confidence and quiet every storm in their soul. Replace every lie they believed with your truth. Teach them to trust themselves again, to walk boldly in their worth, and to never shrink to be loved. Surround them with clarity, wisdom, and peace that passes understanding. May their next chapter be filled with joy, grace, and genuine love. In Jesus' name, let every heavy heart say, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.